I had sacrificed everything for my family. I worked 12 hours a day at grueling jobs for them, but they lied about me. What would you do if you found out? What I did was secretly buy the house they were living in. Hello, my name is Jacqueline. A year after my family rejected me, one Saturday morning while I was doing the dishes, my brother came to my door excitedly and said, "You're here." Those words touched me deeply. For years, I had worked and struggled for my family, sending them half of my meager salary. A person feels so incomplete when their family isn't there. But they thought I deserved to hear those words. Sit back and relax. Let me tell you this exciting story and share what happened to me. "They're telling people you vanished," her cousin said, the words landing soft and heavy at once. "Your mother told the whole church you probably got mixed up with the wrong people out there. That you stopped calling because you're ashamed." The scenario playing out in my mind at that moment had taken a very different turn. As I set the dishes I was holding down on the old kitchen counter and wiped my hands on a towel, I remained silent. Jacqueline paused for a moment. She never liked to answer right away. She tied her hair back, scratched her head lightly, and leaned against her pillow with the bold cat print. She loved cats very much. She was looking at the crack in the plaster above the window. That crack took her back to a memory from her childhood. As she gazed absently at the crack, she reminisced at length about her happy memories from the past. Memories of playing ball and playing house with her sibling flashed before her eyes like a movie reel. When he returned to reality, the ceiling had absorbed so much water that its color had shifted from white to shades of yellow and brown. It resembled the color of milky coffee. You could even say it looked a bit like egg yolk. The crack in the wall plaster had widened so much that a spider web had formed inside it. Do you think a person could live in a house like this? She had known, of course, some quiet, unlit part of her had known for months. But knowing and hearing were two very different kinds of pain, arriving through two very different doors. 4 years earlier, she had made a decision that felt, at the time, like the only decent thing a daughter could do in her own mind. She had made the right decision at the time, but would what was to come bring her peace of mind? Her father, Richard, had lost his logistics job when the regional freight company folded, and the mortgage on the old colonial at the corner of Birchwater Lane had gone from manageable to menacing within a single tax season. So Jacqueline, 26 then and freshly hired at a mid-sized accounting firm 2 states away, had started wiring half her paycheck home every second Friday without fail. Without complaint, put yourself in Jacqueline's shoes, try to empathize with her. You're far from home, working hard on your own, and sending half your salary back to your family. Being away from home is already a difficult situation. Those who've been through it know this well. But after months, your family isn't very happy, despite all the sacrifices you've made. She remembered the first transfer with an almost embarrassing clarity. The way her hands had trembled slightly over the keyboard, not from doubt, but from a strange swelling pride, the feeling of finally being useful to the people who raised her. Her mother's serene, smiling face, her father's confident demeanor as he squared his shoulders. In that moment, she hadn't pictured her brother Caleb at all, and that omission would come to haunt her later, sharply and specifically. She sensed this because Caleb was always the one causing trouble. Even as a child, he would run to my mother and constantly complain, saying, "Mom, my sister did this. She's doing that." The woman's apartment, where she now lived, was small, with all the flaws that had characterized her shopping. It had a narrow hallway kitchen, a rickety cupboard door that never quite aligned and closed, and a radiator that rattled twice before the room finally closed. The man's house was in a deserted corner of a roadside neighborhood. Few cars passed by. It consisted of an old kitchen, a bathroom, a toilet, and a single room. The woman had chosen a life of frugalness and frugality. Her day consisted of eating the same modest lunches, wearing the same 3 plain blazers, all done so that every hard-earned dollar leaving my account every 2 weeks felt like it had a real purpose, not just a sacrifice. For the first year, she had completely believed in the story she was financing. Her mother, Jacqueline, always called it, in the same memorized tone, an investment in the family, a bridge that stretched until Richard found a new job. And Jacqueline didn't believe in bridges so much that she didn't ask for a chance to see her plans. Like most silent disasters, this incident began with something so small it went unnoticed. At the time, we didn't think much of it. We figured, what's the worst that could happen? A photo of Caleb standing next to his brand new bright cherry red pickup truck. The balloon he'd gotten from the dealership was attached to the rearview mirror. The photo was posted with the caption, "My new truck," but it was deleted within an hour, yet it was already too late to undo the damage it had caused. There would never be any way to make up for this. Next to the photo were 3 laughing emojis, and finally the caption, "I'm treating myself to something." Caleb was always buying himself things, random, unnecessary things. That photograph lingered on a salty night. In the blue, static light of the phone screen, she felt a hollow-like agony and an eerie silence curling in on herself. There was no rawness, no middle outrage, only a slow, dreadful readjustment, the kind of realization that the story a person has told their whole life needs a completely different ending. He didn't confront anyone that night. Somewhere in the 28 years, he learned that the rare true faces born of raw shock only produce better, faster, and more polished lies. So she waited, watched, and began to ask, without hesitation, carefully chosen questions that never sounded accusatory. A neighbor from Millhaven Hollow, an old woman named Dorothy, who, as Jacqueline's daughter, had pooled every penny for library books, casually mentioned Richard's new roof, this time a new unpatched roof. Another cousin let slip that Caleb had begun to call himself an entrepreneur, a kind of private coffee cart downtown, funded by family backing at opening speeches. Family backing. That phrase lingered in Jacqueline's mind for days. Like a stone spinning in a drum, it eroded the last soft folds of her patience. She began to pull out the old bank extensions, not out of suspicion, but out of a need to see the form of her own generosity laid out before her in black and white columns, a record of her silent connection, one she never questioned. What she found there was not evidence of a struggling family trying to survive. Slowly, and then completely, it was proof of a family taught to view it as a resource that wouldn't deplete their money, something that was always there, natural, like electricity or running water, something that didn't require bile. She remembered precisely the moment the last thread of denial finally snapped. It was a rainy Thursday evening. A dazzling blue light was streaming through the window, and the rice left in the chipped ceramic bowl his grandmother had given him had begun to warm up again. Since the stove was very old, it had been a real struggle to get it going. He was hungry, and at that moment his eyes filled with tears. He couldn't accept that his family had abandoned him. He had no appetite as he ate the rice. As she heated and ate her rice, her mother came to mind. Just then, her mother called almost casually, asking if that month's transfer could happen a few days early, because she needed to deposit money for Caleb's team. Jacqueline sat there with the phone to her ear, watching the curl of steam rising from the rice, and something inside her suddenly became very quiet and very clear, like the stillness of a lake before a harsh frost begins. Yes, of course, he said he'd send the money early. His voice was as calm and warm as ever. Then, after hanging up, she sat down at the small kitchen table and made a decision that seemed more like mathematics than anger. She didn't make the transfer that month, nor did she send it the following month. She decided not to send a message this month. Let's see what would happen. There was no conversation to share this news. Her family didn't come over for dinner to hear what had happened. Jacqueline let her voice speak as it wished. She let it speak in a language her family would struggle to understand on their own. Everything was entirely under her control, as it always was. She said she wasn't in pain. She didn't even believe her own words. She was simply going to return to her 4-year silence. As she spoke these words, she wasn't thinking of anything at that moment. She was listening to her heart, unpredictable, unforeseeable. What was impossible was the story her parents would choose to tell to fill the void she left behind. For the truth was that their dutiful daughter had simply financed their comfort, a comforting fact that neither Richard nor his mother were willing to live in the public eye, making them complicit. So they wrote another story in her place, a softer one for themselves, but a devastating one for her. To the extended family, they told Jacqueline that something had gone wrong, that it wasn't clear what, that instead of naming the right person, respectable people had been given the subject of some kind of trouble. To Dorothy, to the vicar of the small stone church on Hollow Road in Elm, and to everyone who asked about her, they told her that their daughter had probably gone through some hard times, preventing her from seeking guaranteed help, that she was terribly confused about where she might have fallen, constantly developing a terrible predicament. Jacqueline later realized it was a masterpiece of silent cruelty, for it hadn't required a grand lie, only a slow, unified understanding, whispered pleas and lowered voices. A story told by a grieving mother, a truth accepted as simple because she hadn't bothered to ask anyone, was unfolding. She learned it slowly, piecemeal, much like someone who learns they've been slandered by people who claim to love them. Hear a message. They're a strange, condolence-toned comment, its origins unpieced, reaching out with careful and painful language from an old family friend. By the time she grasped the whole form of the story told by people like this, it had already spread far beyond what could be resolved with a simple phone call. I think at that moment her plans changed dramatically, and she was preparing to make her real decision. And there was something almost darkly didactic about her realizing this. Sitting alone in her house while the rain still regularly hit the window pane, she could have actually screamed it out to the town, and it would have sounded to its people, already prepared for pity, like the boundless defense of someone who had something to hide. Now she understood with a comforting clarity that denial wasn't the tool this moment needed. Therefore, she denied nothing. He didn't scream and yell at his mother. He didn't issue an angry public statement. He didn't drive 400 miles to stand in front of the house on Birchwater Lane in a way that would set an example of never. Instead, he did something far quieter, far more patient, something that would take much of the next 4 years to fully take shape. She began, without telling a single soul, to learn everything there was to know about the mortgage on her parents' house. He continued his investigations without pause, unraveling the mystery of each case one by one. At times he grew very tired. He took a sip of the cold tea on the table, but the look of dissatisfaction on his face did nothing to dampen his drive to work. He kept working non-stop. It started almost by accident. A conversation with a colleague at the accounting firm who specialized in distressed property portfolios, who mentioned offhand how easily a family home's debt could be acquired by a private party under the right circumstances. how banks were often more willing to negotiate than people assumed, especially with a homeowner who had a documented history of missed and delayed payments. Jacqueline had listened to that explanation with a stillness that surprised even her. Feeling something cold and clear settle into place behind her ribs, at that moment, he thought of home, something she had never actually done, since it had been quite a while since she'd left home. The white colonial-style house with peeling green shutters and an old wooden door. The kitchen where he did his homework at the oak table covered in scratches. The upstairs window where he would sit and watch the rain move sideways across hollow as if it were a living thing. And the springtime flower scenes she'd drawn herself stuck to the window. Despite everything, when she thought of home, that was the only place that came to mind. And she understood, sitting in her narrow apartment with her cold rice and her quiet fury, that there was a version of justice available to her that required no confrontation at all. It only required patience, discretion, and a very particular kind of financial fluency that she happened, by pure and useful coincidence, to possess. There was one thing he didn't yet fully know: how long this would go on. She only knew that he possessed that calm and eerie quality of someone who had finally given up hope of being understood, and that she was tired of being the driving force behind a story that cast her as the villain amid all this chaos. Suddenly her eyes fell on the cute little birds outside. They were building a nest for themselves with small twigs. They seemed anxious. Like every living creature, they too needed a home. He thought to himself, 2 twigs can make the birds happy. Maybe what matters isn't the home itself, but the family bond within it, being one, being together. Outside her window, the rain, as always, continued to fall freely and ceaselessly, heedless of whatever quiet decisions were being made beneath it. Some 400 miles away, in a house she once called home, a family was telling a comforting lie about their missing daughter. They had no idea that she was preparing to make her presence felt more than ever before in their lives. 4 years is not a long time compared to a mountain, but it is an eternity compared to silence. And Jacqueline, just as she had learned to live among other people, without feeling out of place, though with difficulty, learned to live within that silence. She did not search for her home. She learned to remain strong on her own. She did not write letters explaining herself. She simply worked and watched, and let the architecture of her plan grow one careful beam at a time. The first year was the hardest because she had stopped sending money, not financially, but psychologically. Because a sense of guilt would creep in like an uninvited guest, appearing reasonable, whispering that perhaps she had been too harsh, or that her parents deserved one more chance to explain themselves honestly. Jacqueline couldn't stop wondering. She couldn't help but think she might have made her decision too hastily, whether the decision had deeply affected her family, both financially and emotionally. Maybe they really were spending that money on their needs. Her mind was so overwhelmed and cluttered that she couldn't sleep at night, but she had to make a decision and stand by it. Her family couldn't love her just for her money. She wasn't worth that much. No family would go that far. If you were in her shoes, what would you do? Would you struggle to make a decision? She remembered sitting by the window in her apartment on a particularly dark, rainy night, staring at her phone. After running her finger over her mother's profile picture for nearly 10 minutes, she stood up with tears in her eyes, took a sip of water from the glass in her hand, and placed her phone face down on the counter before walking away completely. Jacqueline wanted to call her mother. She missed her so much. Living alone was very hard. She imagined the cakes her mother used to bake when she was little and the warm milk, how happily and enjoyably she used to eat and drink them. Every morning before she went to school, her mother would prepare them and send her off to school. What had changed since then? How had her family turned into people like this? What kept her steady, more than anger, was a growing and specific curiosity about the mechanics of the house itself. She began meeting secretly with a mortgage attorney named Priya Anand. Priya was a successful, intelligent and unhurried woman with brown hair who dressed just as elegantly as she looked. She worked 2 floors below Jacqueline's office in an old textile building downtown. Their initial meetings didn't yield much of a result. These were time-consuming matters that were difficult to resolve. "You understand," Priya told her during one of their first real strategy sessions, sunlight cutting thin gold lines across her desk through half-closed blinds, "that once you acquire the note, you're not just a lender. You become their landlord, legally and completely, the moment their payments lapse far enough." Jacqueline merely shook her head at these words. She felt the weight of this thought settle within her, like a stone carefully cast into deep waters. Such situations were not ones she was accustomed to. "I'm not doing this out of a desire for revenge," she told herself at that moment. Yet later, she would admit that the line between justice and revenge was far thinner than people liked to claim. Her reason for doing this was, above all, to see what those who had written their own version of her story in her absence would do when confronted with the truth once more. In the months that followed, he never fully recovered from the blow of his father, Richard, losing his logistics job. And after the money stopped coming in, he began borrowing from neighbors to make ends meet. His father refused to work. There were new missed payments, first quiet and forgivable, then more frequent, then serious enough to draw formal notices from the bank. Jacqueline read those details in dry legal summaries prepared by Priya's office, and each one landed with a strange double weight. Sorrow for the father she remembered teaching her to ride a bike down Birchwater Lane, and a colder, clearer recognition of the pattern that had brought them here. Caleb, meanwhile, seemed entirely unaware that anything was fraying beneath him. Jacqueline followed his public life the way a distant weather system follows a coastline, never approaching, but always visible on the horizon. Caleb didn't care about anything. He only thought of himself. He never worked anywhere and didn't help my mom and dad at home. He rebelled against everything. Despite all that, he managed to become the most beloved child in the family. In fact, once when we were very young, my mom was scolding him for skipping school, so he grabbed his backpack and left the house. Even though he came back about 2 hours later, my mom had become worried as if he wouldn't come back at all. Caleb knew my mom and dad very well and knew exactly how to handle them. New photographs popped up every few months online. A leased sports coupe, a rooftop dinner in a city 2 hours from Millhaven Hollow, a short-lived, expensive attempt at a specialty coffee cart business that quietly folded in 8 months without a word. Each glimpse confirmed what she already suspected. The money she sent home out of pure duty wasn't keeping the lights on. It was feeding an image Caleb was desperate to maintain. But I was working 12-hour days to earn that money, she thought bitterly. And it was all spent on Caleb's unnecessary things. By the middle of the second year, the mortgage on the house at Birchwater Lane had fallen far behind. It entered what Priya called a workable window, that delicate gap where a private buyer could step in and deal directly with the lender before public foreclosure hit. Jacqueline remembered the exact night she decided to move forward. She sat alone at her kitchen table with a cup of cold tea at her elbow. Rain tapped softly against the window pane, ticking away the seconds like a clock. "If we do this," Priya warned her carefully during their final planning call, "there's no clean way to undo it later. You'll hold the actual title. Whatever happens next happens because you decide it happens." Jacqueline sat with that warning for a long moment. The old ache of her childhood bedroom ceiling stain rushed back into her mind. She remembered the crooked porch step. She heard her mother's voice calling her in for dinner on early autumn evenings that once felt endless and safe. Then she thought of Dorothy at the bakery, repeating a lie about a daughter lost to trouble. She thought of a pastor offering condolences for a disappearance that never happened. And finally, she thought of the quiet nights she spent eating plain rice in a narrow apartment. Also, a truck with a dealership balloon could sit gleaming in a driveway 400 miles away. "Do it," she said. The acquisition took another 11 months to finish. It was a slow, unglamorous process of paperwork, verification, and patient negotiation. It looked nothing like the dramatic revenge people picture in movies. Long stretches of nothing went by. Jacqueline simply went to work, came home, watered the single stubborn pothos plant on her windowsill, and waited for updates packed with dense legal text. But beneath that dull surface, something enormous was quietly shifting. Title clause by title clause, filing by filing. The deed to Birchwater Lane moved into her name and no one else's. The house now belonged to Jacqueline. She kept telling herself, "I worked, I earned it, and this house is what I got in return for that money." That's how she comforted herself. She did not tell her family. She did not tell Caleb. She let the story they built about her, the vanished daughter, the cautionary tale whispered over church coffee hours, continue running unchallenged in Millhaven Hollow. She understood that its unraveling would hit far harder coming from cold proof than from heated arguments. The feeling of guilt had returned. Now that the risks had become much greater, that feeling had grown even more acute. On the nights he lay awake, he would ponder deeply about the girl who had once, out of a pure and uncomplicated love, sent half her salary home, and how she had now become a colder person. Suddenly, the image of the pickup truck flashed into his mind, the balloon still absurdly tied to the mirror, and that memory had restored his resolve. A modest county office 2 towns over recorded and finalized the paperwork. Not a single relative, neighbor, or family friend had any idea it occurred. Jacqueline received the final confirmation email from Priya on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. She was standing in her kitchen in worn socks, looking at the pothos plant finally thriving on the sill. She expected to feel triumphant. Instead, she felt something heavier, like grief settling gently over an old wound. Why did she feel that way? She had won and bought the house, after all, yet a sense of unease twisted inside her, as if she were doing something wrong. Do you think it's normal for her to feel that way? Around this time, the final piece of the story reached her through her cousin's careful, apologetic voice on the phone. Richard and her mother, believing they still owned the house, had begun quietly talking about selling it. They wanted to use the remaining equity to fund a new, bigger version of Caleb's business schemes, a mobile retail concept he was pitching to anyone who would listen. They were talking about listing the property within the month and finally ridding themselves of the drafty old colonial and its endless repairs. In the early hours of the next morning, as the sun's heartwarming glow streamed into the room, Jacqueline stood completely still in her apartment. She felt something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite sorrow, but a deeper, more complicated emotion. They were preparing to sell a house that no longer belonged to them to fund the exact same pattern that had consumed 4 years of her devotion. It was the final piece of evidence she needed. Nothing about the underlying dynamic had ever changed. Should she have prepared one last surprise for them before leaving her family in a complete state of shock? She chose a Sunday evening for what came next. Sundays in the city where his family lived always followed a certain ritual. Sitting down with his family for a family meal around the oak table while enjoying pleasant conversation, the delicious aroma of food wafting from the kitchen, and more. He drove the nearly 6-hour journey alone, keeping a firm grip on the steering wheel. A briefcase sat on the leather passenger seat. Inside were documents that would put an end to a 4-year-long lie in less than 60 seconds. These documents were so powerful that they were enough to secure the house. Priya offered to come along, and Jacqueline accepted. The moment required confirmation, not confrontation, an unimpeachable witness to a truth too enormous for words alone. The rain started again by the time they reached Birchwater Lane. Fine. Steady streaks beaded on the windshield as Jacqueline parked across the street. She was getting ready to go out when her eye caught the pale yellow light seeping in from the corner of the curtain. She watched the shadows move above the kitchen window as they always did. A whole 4 years, she thought to herself. How had those years passed? She climbed the rickety porch steps. The slope she felt beneath her feet brought back memories of the past. Priya walked right beside her, calm and composed, with a slim folder tucked beneath her arm. Jacqueline did not knock the way a daughter knocks. She knocked the way someone knocks when they already hold every answer. As the door swung open very quickly, he suddenly saw his mother standing right in front of him. A charming smile and a warm, heartfelt expression had appeared on her face. However, an incident that occurred a few minutes later left him stunned. A few minutes later, Richard appeared beside him. Then came Caleb, drawn by the unfamiliar voices, still holding a fork from the dinner table. Immediately after the events, the look on her face had changed. "Jacqueline," her mother said, stammering and looking shy. Her voice trembled with surprise and feigned concern. "We didn't know you were coming. We were so worried. We didn't know where you were." "I know what you told people," Jacqueline said. Her voice was quiet even and completely without heat. "I know what you've been saying for 4 years." The silence that followed hung heavier than any shout. Jacqueline stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. Priya followed a respectful half-step behind. She approached the table, pulled the chair towards herself, and slowly sat down. He placed his leather briefcase on the table and opened it with trembling hands. Jacqueline paused her meal, breaking the silence. "Do you know what's in this file?" she asked softly, looking at the astonished faces around the table. Her family continued to listen, watching her. "My dear family, who never cared about me and never loved me, even though I sent you half of everything I earned. I didn't disappear," she said. She laid the first document flat, the county seal on the new deed catching the warm kitchen light. I was buying this house. No one spoke. Richard's face betrayed his surprise. His mother, with a look of dissatisfaction as if she regretted what she had done, slowly brought her hand to her mouth. Caleb, meanwhile, just stared at the documents. At first he was confused, but then, as it slowly dawned on him, he looked at Jacqueline and said, "So you're taking the house over?" The whole family listened to Jacqueline in a state of complete disbelief. They stood there asking themselves, how could something like this happen? "And here's the current deed," Jacqueline continued, pushing a second document forward. Her tone stayed completely calm and measured, carrying none of the burning fury that had lived inside her for 4 long years. "And this is a standard month-to-month lease agreement. It takes effect on the 1st of next month, set at fair market rate for the area. You—" Her mother started, her voice cracking violently. "You can't just— This is our home. We've lived here for 30 years. You can't—" "I can," Jacqueline said gently, "because it's mine now, legally, completely, and it has been for months." She let those words heavy drop onto the table. His father's tension was evident in his manner. The atmosphere was far from peaceful. There was the quiet weariness of a woman who had finally laid down a burden she had been carrying alone for far too long. "Sent you money for 4 years? Because I believed you needed it to survive," she said. "Then I found out that this money was being spent on sports cars, coffee trucks, and a lifestyle you never invited me to share in. And I did what had to be done. So I stopped, and instead of telling people the truth, that your daughter stopped paying for things she never owed you in the first place, you told everyone I vanished. You said I was ashamed. You told them I was lost. Everything was out in the open now. The necessary words were spoken, and she had laid out their exact mistake with brutal clarity." Her mother was crying, quiet and stunned. An old, tender part of Jacqueline ached at the sight, a part of her that would probably always ache at her mother's tears, no matter what lies hid behind them. But she didn't soften her voice. She didn't reach out to comfort her. "I was never lost," she said. "I was just done being invisible." She didn't raise her voice for the rest of it. She laid out the lease terms in the same steady, business-like tone she'd use with any stranger. The rent due date, the basic maintenance rules, and the 60-day notice if they decided to pack up and leave instead. Richard didn't argue. Something in his eyes went completely hollow and resigned, the look of a man watching a 4-year lie collapse under its own weight. "You could have just told us," Caleb finally muttered, his voice thin and sounding like a child's. "You could have just talked to us instead of pulling a move like this." Jacqueline looked at him, feeling a mix of pity and absolute finality settle in her chest. "I tried talking for 4 years," she said quietly. "Nobody listened until I stopped being useful." Didn't it occur to you, she thought, while I was eating dry rice in a cold apartment with a leaky ceiling, that we could have worked this out by talking? Where were you back then, Caleb? Why didn't you ever call me? Didn't you ever wonder how I was doing? I don't know if you realize it, but since the title deed to this house is currently in my name, we're living here together. I want you to perceive this as a victory. She closed the files on the table neatly, tucked them under her arm, and turned towards the door. Priya didn't say a word. Jacqueline paused just once, her hand resting on the frame of the crooked porch step. She felt its familiar tilt beneath her palm one last time, while rain fell soft and steady beyond the porch light. He requested that the rent payment be made in about a week. Behind him, the house on Birchwater Lane looked as usual. He opened the old torn curtains and said, "Let some light in." Inside, everything had changed forever. Just like the foundation cracked silently long before the walls began to crumble. The following week, the gossip spread at Millhaven Hollow, as it always does in small towns, on front porches, at church coffee times, and over the counter of Dorothy's bakery. This time, the rumor wasn't just an untrue fabrication. This document was completely genuine. The house title deed was now his. Jacqueline returned to her apartment that night in a way that the rain followed her home. It was raining beautifully. He was quite wet. When he finally got into bed, he didn't feel a sense of great victory. But for the first time in 4 years, he felt completely at home here. She wasn't a tragic rumor in a town 400 miles away anymore. She was finally just herself. As he was lost in thought, he put on his pajamas and lay down in bed. Today had been an exhausting, heartbreaking, and yet triumphant day. He had seen his family for the first time in years, but the visit hadn't gone very smoothly. I guess he'd never be able to figure out whether he'd done the right thing or the wrong thing. Yes, dear viewers, if your family treated you this way, how would you react to them? Write your comments below. I read them all. See you next time.